There is a Tudor mansion in Giles County, Tennessee, that does not belong to the American South. It rises from rolling farmland like something lifted from the English countryside and dropped by mistake into the hills between Nashville and the Alabama border, built by a man who had everything money could buy except the one thing he craved most: acceptance. This is the story of Franklin Clarence Mars and his rural exile. Not the story you think you know from corporate histories or chocolate wrapper trivia, but the deeper, stranger tale of how a disabled boy from Minnesota turned sugar and air into millions, how those millions turned into obsession, and how obsession turned into a 2,800-acre fortress that would outlive its creator by less than the time it took to build. Most people know the Mars name. The candy bars sit in every checkout aisle in America. Milky Way, Snickers, Three Musketeers. The Mars Corporation today is a faceless global machine worth over $100 billion. Privately held, paranoid about secrecy, ruthlessly efficient. But in the hills of Tennessee stands the anti-thesis of that empire, a physical manifestation of everything the modern Mars, Incorporated, has spent a century trying to hide: vulnerability, extravagance, and the messy human need for validation that no amount of chocolate-coated nougat can satisfy. The mansion sits empty most days now. Occasionally it hosts weddings or corporate events. People take photographs on the grand staircase, sip champagne in rooms where a dying man once tried to outrun his mortality with architecture. They do not know the real story. They do not know about the father-son civil war fought with balance sheets and bricks. They do not know about the 935 workers who built a palace during the Great Depression while the country starved. They do not know about the dining room table that physically cannot be removed without demolishing walls, a perfect metaphor for a life spent building monuments that become prisons. This investigation is not a tour of beautiful rooms. It is an autopsy of ambition. We are going to follow the money, trace the psychological wounds, and examine what happens when new wealth collides with old hierarchies, when physical limitation collides with limitless capital, when a father's dream becomes his son's nightmare. If you value deep investigations into American business history, the invisible class wars that shaped the country, and the human costs hidden behind every corporate success story, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now, let us enter the gates of Milky Way Farm and discover what Franklin Mars was really trying to build. 1. The Boy Who Could Not Run Hancock, Minnesota. 1883. Winter. The cold here was not poetic. It was brutal, a physical force that could kill within hours if you were unprepared. Survival in this landscape required strength, endurance, the ability to chop wood, haul water, work the frozen soil. This was not a place for the weak. Franklin Clarence Mars was born weak. The diagnosis came early: poliomyelitis. Polio. In the late 19th century, this was not just a disease. It was a life sentence. While other boys ran, fought, learned to plow fields and ride horses, Frank was confined to chairs, beds, the narrow radius his crutch would allow. His legs were thin, atrophied. He would walk with difficulty for his entire life. In a world where masculinity was defined by physical capability, Frank Mars started with a deficit he could never fully overcome. But here is where the story becomes interesting. Immobility became observation. While other children participated in the world, Frank studied it. He watched, he analyzed. He noticed patterns that the physically capable missed because they were too busy moving to see. His universe contracted to the size of his mother's kitchen, and that kitchen became his laboratory. Elva Mars, his mother, taught him the only craft that required no running: confectionery, hand-dipping chocolates. The process was simple but required precision. Melt chocolate to exactly the right temperature. Dip the cream or nougat center. Let it cool on waxed paper. Repeat for hours, for days. A lame boy sitting by a wood stove, inhaling cocoa and sugar, creating small luxuries, while outside the Minnesota winter tried to kill everything that moved. This was not just occupational therapy. This was the birth of an empire, though no one knew it yet. Frank's education was sporadic. He attended school when his health allowed, but his real education happened in that kitchen. He learned chemistry without knowing the word. He learned temperature control. He learned that chocolate was not just food, it was transformation. You could take cheap ingredients, sugar, milk powder, cocoa, and through precise application of heat and technique, create something people would pay money for. Something that made them smile. For a boy who could not participate in normal childhood, who could not compete physically. This was power. By the time Frank was 19, he had a plan. It was 1902. America was changing. Industrialization was accelerating. Cities were growing. The old agrarian economy was giving way to factories, railroads, mass production. There was opportunity if you could see it. Frank saw it. He would sell candy. On August 19, 1902, he married Ethel Kissick. She was practical, hard-working, willing to bet on this disabled young man with big ideas. In 1903, they had a son, Forrest Edward Mars. It seemed like the beginning of the American dream. Young family, new business, unlimited potential. It was not. What followed was not a steady climb to success. It was 2 decades of catastrophic failure. The serial failure. Frank Mars was not a natural businessman. He was a confectioner with ambitions that exceeded his capital, his experience, and his luck. Between 1902 and 1920, he failed repeatedly, spectacularly, in ways that would have destroyed most people. First attempt, Tacoma, Washington, 1911. He called it the Mars Candy Factory Company. The name was grander than the reality. It was small-scale production, artisanal. Frank made good chocolates, but good was not enough. He could not scale. He could not compete with larger manufacturers. He did not understand distribution. Creditors circled. By the time the business collapsed, they took everything. Furniture, personal belongings. Everything that could be carried was carried out by men with legal documents and cold eyes. Frank and his second wife, he had divorced Ethel Kissick in 1910, lost custody of young Forrest, and remarried a woman also named Ethel Healy, were left in an empty house. The humiliation was total. This detail is crucial. Frank Mars knew poverty from both sides. He was born into it, he escaped it briefly. Then he fell back into it, harder, because now he had tasted the alternative. That psychological whiplash shaped everything that came after. He would spend the rest of his life trying to ensure he never felt that vulnerable again. By 1920, Frank was 37 years old. Most men had established careers by this age. Frank had bankruptcy filings and a collection of lessons learned the hard way. He returned to Minneapolis with $400 in his pocket, roughly $6,000 in modern terms. Not nothing, but not much. Certainly not enough to suggest that within a decade he would be a millionaire many times over. What changed? He changed. Or more precisely, his understanding of the market changed. The candy industry in 1920 was dominated by companies like Hershey and Nestle. They sold chocolate bars in simple formats: milk chocolate, dark chocolate, almond chocolate. These were solid slabs of cocoa and sugar, expensive to produce because chocolate was expensive. The bars were small. They were positioned as occasional treats for the middle class or luxuries for the wealthy. Frank Mars looked at this market and saw an opening, a gap, an opportunity that everyone else was missing. America was urbanizing rapidly. Factory workers, office clerks, shop girls, these people did not have time for leisurely tea with fancy chocolates. They needed quick energy. They needed something that felt substantial but was cheap enough to buy every day. They needed what would later be called a meal replacement, though no one used that term yet. The idea came from an unexpected source: the malted milkshake. Malted milk was huge in the 1920s. Drugstore soda fountains sold chocolate, malted milkshakes for 10 or 15 cents. They were thick, rich, filling. People loved them. But you could not carry a milkshake onto a factory floor. You could not put it in your pocket. Frank Mars thought, what if you could? What if you could take that flavor, that sensation of creamy chocolate and malt, and make it solid? Portable. Cheap. 1923. The Milky Way bar launches. 3. Air and sugar. The Milky Way was not a chocolate bar in the traditional sense. It was an engineering marvel disguised as a confection. The base was nougat, whipped egg whites, corn syrup, sugar, and malt flavoring. This mixture was beaten until it was full of tiny air bubbles, creating volume without weight. Then it was coated in a thin layer of caramel and an even thinner layer of milk chocolate. The result was visually enormous. A Milky Way bar was much larger than a Hershey's bar, but it was mostly air. The cost to produce it was significantly lower than a solid chocolate bar of the same size. Frank Mars was selling air coated in chocolate, and the American public loved it. Why? Because it looked like abundance. In an era when people were becoming cost-conscious, when every nickel mattered, Frank Mars offered them a deal that felt too good to be true, a giant bar of chocolate for 5 cents. The same price competitors charged for something half the size. The slogan was perfect. Food, not just candy. This positioned the bar not as an indulgence, but as sustenance. You were not treating yourself. You were feeding yourself. This mattered psychologically. It gave permission. Even frugal consumers could justify buying a Milky Way because it was practical. Sales were immediate and overwhelming. First year, $800,000 in revenue. Roughly $12 million in today's terms. By 1924, the company was doing several million dollars a year. By 1928, it was among the largest candy manufacturers in the United States, competing directly with companies that had decades head start. Frank Mars, the disabled boy from Minnesota, the man who had his furniture repossessed, was suddenly rich. Not just comfortable. Rich. In 1928, the company's annual revenue exceeded $20 million. In modern terms, that is approximately $350 million. Frank personally was worth several million, at least $50 million in today's money, possibly more. The exact figure is hard to pin down because the company was private, but by all accounts, Frank Mars was one of the wealthiest self-made men in America. He invented other bars. The Snickers bar, named after one of his favorite horses, launched in 1930 and became an even bigger hit. 3 Musketeers followed. The Mars Company was an industrial juggernaut, producing millions of bars a week from a factory complex in Chicago. But money did something to Frank Mars. It did not heal his psychological wounds. It magnified them. 4. What money cannot buy Chicago in the late 1920s was a city of extremes. Wealth and poverty lived side by side. Gangsters like Al Capone controlled entire neighborhoods. The stock market soared to irrational heights. The wealthy built mansions on the North Shore, threw parties that made the newspapers, competed for social dominance. Frank Mars wanted in. He bought a mansion on the North Side. He bought expensive cars, Duesenbergs, Cadillacs with V16 engines. He wore tailored suits. He joined clubs. He threw money at the problem of acceptance. It did not work. Chicago society in the 1920s was still stratified by old money versus new money. Families like the McCormicks, the Fields, the Pullmans, these were dynasties built on railroads, real estate, manufacturing empires that spanned decades. They had pedigree. They had history. They had something Frank Mars could never buy: legitimacy. To them, Frank was a candy king, the chocolate man, a nouveau riche with a crutch and a factory that smelled like sugar. His money was too new, too obviously earned, too tied to something as trivial as candy bars. He was useful for charity donations. He was amusing at parties. But he was not one of them. This rejection drove Frank Mars in a direction that would define the rest of his life and create the Tennessee estate that is the subject of this investigation. He decided, if they will not accept me in their world, I will build my own world, a world where I am not a supplicant but a king, not a guest but a god. He began looking for land, not in Chicago, not in any city where the old money families could look down on him. He wanted space, isolation, a place where he could create a kingdom from scratch, where his wealth would not be compared to anyone else's because there would be no one else to compare it to. He looked south. 5. The purchase Giles County, Tennessee, 1930. The county sits in the south-central part of the state, close to the Alabama border. It is rural, agricultural, poor. The economy is based on cotton, tobacco, and subsistence farming. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, Giles County barely noticed because it had so little connection to the financial markets, but it felt the depression soon enough. Crop prices collapsed. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. Into this desperate landscape came Franklin Mars with a checkbook. He bought land, a lot of land. Initially 1,000 acres, then more. By the time he was finished, he owned approximately 2,800 acres of rolling hills, forests, streams. This was not a farm. This was a fiefdom. In modern terms, that is roughly 4.4 square miles. For comparison, Central Park in New York City is 1.3 square miles. Frank Mars bought more than 3 Central Parks in rural Tennessee. The price was cheap by his standards. Land in Giles County during the Depression was selling for a fraction of what it would have been worth a few years earlier. Estimates suggest he paid somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 for the land, roughly $900,000 to $1.8 million in modern dollars. For a man whose company was generating $20 million a year, this was pocket change. But the land was just the beginning. Frank Mars did not want a farm. He wanted an estate. He wanted something that would make the Chicago elite drive down from the north, see what he built, and understand that he was not just rich. He was powerful. He was visionary. He was a king. Construction began in 1931. The timing was insane. America was collapsing. Banks were failing. Unemployment hit. 25%. Breadlines stretched for blocks, and Frank Mars was about to spend millions of dollars building a palace. 6. The Army of 935. The project was not construction, it was colonization. Frank Mars approached the estate the way he approached business, with industrial-scale ambition and complete disregard for conventional limits. He did not hire a local contractor. He brought in an army of workers, engineers, architects, craftsmen. At peak construction, 935 people were working on the estate simultaneously. In a county where unemployment was crushing families, this was economic salvation. The payroll was enormous. Workers were paid 50 cents to $1 per hour, depending on skill level, far above what agricultural labor paid. For many families in Giles County, the Mars estate was the difference between survival and starvation. Frank Mars was not just building a house, he was buying loyalty. He was creating a feudal system where he was the lord and everyone else was a vassal, dependent on his generosity. The work began not with the house, but with the land itself. Frank did not like the topography. The hills were too steep in some places, too shallow in others, so he changed them. Crews with dynamite and bulldozers reshaped the landscape. Hills were leveled, valleys were filled, streams were rerouted. This was not landscaping. This was terraforming. Frank Mars, the man who could barely walk, made mountains move at his command. The noise was constant. Explosions echoed across the county. Locals reported hearing blasts from miles away. Trucks hauled tons of earth. Tractors churned the soil. For 3 years, Giles County sounded like a war zone. Next came the infrastructure. Barns. Not small wooden structures, but industrial buildings. 30 of them, each designed to house horses in luxury that exceeded most human dwellings. Stone foundations, hardwood interiors, electric lighting, this in a region where many farms still used kerosene lamps. Ventilation, systems to keep the air fresh. Heated water troughs. Frank Mars loved horses. For a man whose legs betrayed him, horses were borrowed strength. Sitting in a saddle, he was taller, faster, more powerful than his body allowed. He spared no expense. He bought thoroughbreds, racing stock, breeding stallions. At its peak, Milky Way Farm housed over 100 horses, some worth tens of thousands of dollars each. A hippodrome was constructed, a 1-mile oval track with compacted dirt, professional-grade fencing, grandstands. Frank hosted races, invited Chicago friends down to watch. He wanted them to see that he had built something they could not ignore. The fence around the property was symbolic. Frank wanted stone walls like English estates, but Tennessee did not have endless surface stone. So he bought old stone fences from bankrupt farms across the county. Crews dismantled them, transported them, and rebuilt them around the Mars property. He was literally buying the history of the Old South, breaking it apart, and using it to wall himself off from the world. This act alone tells you everything about Frank Mars's psychology. He was not just rich. He was building a fortress, a castle, a place where the outside world could not touch him. By 1933, the stage was set. The land was conquered, the barns gleamed, the track was ready. The workers' clubhouse was finished, a building nicer than most of the workers' own homes, a place where they could relax after their shifts, proof of Frank's paternalistic generosity. Now it was time to build the mansion itself. 7. The house that Nougat built. The mansion was designed by architect James Ryan, but the vision was entirely Frank Mars's. He wanted Tudor revival, heavy timber framing, steeply pitched roofs, decorative half-timbering, leaded glass windows. Tudor was English. Tudor was aristocracy. Tudor was old money made visible. Never mind that Frank Mars was a disabled candy manufacturer from Minnesota. He wanted to look like a baron. The location was chosen with military precision. The house would sit on the highest hill on the property, overlooking everything. From the upper windows, Frank could see his barns, his track, his lands stretching to the horizon. He wanted to see his kingdom. Construction began in 1933. The house would be enormous, approximately 25,000 square feet of living space. For context, the average American home in 1933 was around 1,000 square feet. Frank Mars was building something 25 times larger than what most families lived in, and he was doing it while the country was on its knees. The materials were absurd. American chestnut beams for the ceilings. This wood was already rare, the species decimated by blight. Frank bought up remaining stocks. The wood had wormholes, marks from insects. He made them a design feature. Wormy chestnut became a status symbol. Stone for the exterior was imported. Roofing tiles were custom made. Windows were leaded glass, some with stained glass panels. The front doors were solid oak, carved, heavy enough that it took 2 people to open them. Inside, 21 bedrooms, 14 bathrooms, multiple fireplaces, each unique, some large enough to walk into. The main hall had ceilings that soared 40 feet, 12 meters. Standing in that room was like standing in a cathedral. The acoustic echo alone was intimidating. The dining room contained the house's most telling feature, the table. It was custom built from solid redwood, 28 feet long, 12 feet wide. It could seat 30 people. But here is the critical detail. The table was too large to fit through any door. The architects designed the room around it. Workers built the table first, then constructed the walls. This table could never be removed without demolishing the house. Think about what that means. Frank Mars, a man who lost everything to creditors in his youth, built a piece of furniture that could never be repossessed. It was permanent. It was a middle finger to the past. It said, "This time, I am staying." Bathrooms were temples of Art Deco hygiene, black Carrara tile, chrome fixtures, multiple showerheads, hot water on demand, a luxury most Americans did not have. For Frank, whose body ached constantly from polio's damage, these bathrooms were therapeutic spaces. He could spend hours soaking, letting hot water ease the pain in his legs. The house had a massive staircase, curved, elegant, sweeping. It was beautiful. It was also something Frank could barely use. Stairs were an obstacle for a man with a crutch, but he built them anyway because they looked right. They looked aristocratic. The entire house was like that, scenery for a life Frank wanted to live but physically could not. Electricity throughout, advanced wiring hidden in the walls. When night fell, the house glowed like a luxury liner in a dark sea. Locals could see the lights from miles away. It was a spectacle. Furniture was imported from Europe and New York. Rugs, art, drapery, everything chosen to convey taste, history, permanence. Frank was building not just a house, but a narrative. He wanted visitors to walk in and believe he was born to this, that his wealth was old, that he belonged, but he did not belong, and he knew it. 8. The Father and the Son. While Frank built his fantasy in Tennessee, his son Forrest was in Chicago, watching with growing horror. Forrest Edward Mars was not like his father. He did not dream. He calculated. He did not care about acceptance or aristocracy. He cared about market share, efficiency, profit margins. He was the future of capitalism, cold, rational, relentless. The tension between father and son was not personal. It was philosophical. Frank believed that money was a tool for creating the life you wanted. Once you were rich, you could spend on pleasure, on status, on dreams. The business existed to serve the man. Forrest believed the opposite. The man existed to serve the business. Profit was not a means to an end. Profit was the end. Every dollar spent on horses, land, and mansions was a dollar stolen from expansion, from competition, from building an empire that could dominate the globe. By 1931, the arguments were constant. Forrest looked at the Tennessee project and saw waste. Frank looked at his son and saw a man without soul, without vision, without the ability to enjoy success. In 1932, the break came. Frank made Forrest an offer. He gave him $50,000 in cash, roughly $1.1 million in today's dollars, and rights to produce the Milky Way bar in foreign markets. In exchange, Forrest would leave, go to Europe, build his own company, stay out of Frank's way. It looked like exile. It was actually liberation. Forrest took the money and went to England. He would build Mars, Limited, and later create M&M's, Uncle Ben's rice, and Pedigree pet food. He would become richer than his father ever was, and he would do it by being everything Frank was not: disciplined, secretive, ruthless. With Forrest gone, Frank had complete freedom to finish his palace. But there was a problem. Frank was dying. 9. The Price of Paradise. By 1933, Frank Mars was a sick man. He had Bright's disease, chronic kidney failure. In the 1930s, this was a death sentence. There was no dialysis, no transplants. The kidneys slowly stopped filtering toxins from the blood. The body swelled. The heart strained under the fluid retention. Pain was constant. Frank knew he was dying. He knew the mansion might be finished too late. So he pushed. He demanded faster work. He paid for multiple shifts. Spotlights were brought in so crews could work at night. The sound of hammers never stopped. Frank Mars was racing death. There is a tragic irony here. He built the most elaborate house in Tennessee history, a place designed for leisure and enjoyment, and he built it under crushing time pressure because his body was failing. The palace was supposed to be his reward. It became his tomb. The house was completed in late 1933. Frank moved in. He got to live in his dream for 4 months. By early 1934, his condition had deteriorated. The local doctors could do nothing. The only hope was Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, one of the best medical facilities in the country. In March, Frank left Tennessee for Maryland. He would never return. On April 8, 1934, at 12:45 p.m., Franklin Clarence Mars died in a hospital room 700 miles from the estate he built. He was 50 years old. The news reached Giles County hours later. The workers froze. The man who paid their wages was gone. What would happen now? Frank's body was transported back to Tennessee. He had built a mausoleum on the estate grounds, a stone structure where he intended to be buried. The funeral was held on the property. It was surreal. America was in the depths of the Depression. Unemployment, desperation, hunger. And here was a funeral procession passing through a 2,800-acre estate with 30 barns, a private hippodrome, and a Tudor mansion that looked like it belonged to English nobility. The workers watched. The widow, Ethel Mars, walked behind the casket. She did not cry. She looked at what they had built, and she made a decision. She would not let it die. 10. The Widow's Gamble. Ethel Fight Mars was not a businesswoman. She was not a manager. She was a society woman who shared her husband's love of horses and luxury. But when Frank died, she surprised everyone. She did not sell. She did not liquidate. She doubled down. Logic said the estate should be closed. It was expensive to maintain. It generated no revenue. The company's accountants wanted to cut losses. Forrest, now in Europe, saw the Tennessee property as a financial black hole. Ethel ignored them all. She took control of the estate and transformed it from a personal playground into a professional operation. If Frank had built the stage, Ethel would put on the show. She focused on the horses. She hired the best trainers. She bought more racing stock. She entered the farm's horses in competitions across the country. The goal was not profit. The goal was vindication. She wanted to prove that Frank's vision was not madness. She wanted to win, and she did. May 4th, 1940. Churchill Downs, Louisville, Kentucky. The Kentucky Derby. A horse named Galahadian, owned by Milky Way Farm, entered the race at odds of 35-1. No one believed in him. The favorite was Bimelech, a dominant champion. Galahadian was an afterthought. But when the gates opened, Galahadian ran the race of his life. Down the stretch, he overtook Bimelech and won. The chocolate horse won the Kentucky Derby. Ethel Mars stood in the winner's circle and accepted the trophy. In that moment, she did what Frank never could. She made the elite applaud. She made them respect the Mars name. The prize was $50,000, roughly $1 million today. But the value was symbolic. Milky Way Farm was no longer the eccentric project of a nouveau riche candy maker. It was a legitimate racing operation. It was a champion. For 5 years, from 1935 to 1940, the estate thrived. Ethel hosted receptions. Politicians, movie stars, business magnates visited. The dining room table that could not be moved was finally used. The mansion came alive. But the reprieve was temporary. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. Everything changed. Maintaining a massive estate with an army of servants and racehorses became unpatriotic. Luxury was suspect. Resources were needed for the war effort. Labor went to factories or the front. Taxes soared. Ethel tried to adapt, but the era of aristocratic farms was over. The Tennessee estate, built as a monument to permanence, was revealed to be fragile. In 1945, Ethel Mars died. The protector was gone. 11. The Fall. With Ethel's death, control passed to Forrest Mars and his sister Patricia. Forrest had no sentimental attachment to the Tennessee property. He had been exiled from it. He saw it as his father's folly, a monument to ego that drained resources from the company. The decision was simple: sell. But selling a 2,800-acre estate with a Tudor mansion in rural Tennessee in 1945 was not easy. The market for such properties barely existed. Who would buy it? What would they do with it? The eventual sale was a humiliation to Frank's memory. The estate, which cost at least $2 to $5 million to build in 1930s money, equivalent to $40 to $100 million today, sold for approximately $250,000, less than 10% of its construction cost. Forrest did not care. He got the liability off the books. The new owners had no emotional connection to the place. They did not see history. They saw real estate. The land was divided. The furniture was sold at auction. Unique pieces that Frank had personally selected were scattered. The horses were sold off. The hippodrome fell into disrepair. The mansion itself stood empty for years. Vandals broke windows. Weather damaged the roof. Vines crept up the Tudor exterior. Nature began, reclaiming what Frank Mars had tried to conquer. For decades, Milky Way Farm was a ghost. Local teenagers told stories about the Chocolate King's haunted mansion. Curiosity seekers broke in to see the decaying grandeur. The dining room table, still there, unmovable, gathered dust. The house that was supposed to stand forever seemed destined for demolition. But in 2009, something unexpected happened. New investors bought the property. They saw potential. They began a restoration, not to return it to a private residence, but to repurpose it as an event venue. Weddings, corporate retreats, photo shoots. Today, Milky Way Farm is open again. The mansion is restored. The grounds are maintained. You can rent the space. You can take pictures on the grand staircase. You can dine at that enormous redwood table. The scenery of tragedy has become the backdrop for celebration. 12. What remains? So what does this forgotten farm teach us? First, that success has two incompatible definitions. Frank Mars achieved success by any material measure. He started with nothing, survived poverty and disability, built a company that made millions, and created an estate that rivaled anything the old money families owned. He should have been satisfied. He was not, because success to Frank was not about money. It was about acceptance, and acceptance could not be bought. Forrest Mars also achieved success. He built a global empire, became richer than his father, dominated markets on multiple continents. But he did it by rejecting everything Frank valued. No ostentation, no sentiment, no vulnerability. Forrest was efficient. He was powerful. He was also, by most accounts, deeply unhappy. So who won? Neither. Both. Second, the story teaches us about the limits of architecture. Frank Mars believed he could build his way to legitimacy. He thought that if the house was grand enough, if the estate was large enough, people would forget where the money came from. They would forget the crutch, the humble origins, the candy bars. It did not work. The Chicago elite never fully accepted him, and even if they had, it would not have healed the wound. Because the wound was not about external validation, it was internal. Frank was trying to outrun his own childhood, his own vulnerability. You cannot do that with stone and timber. Third, the story is a perfect American contradiction. Frank Mars lived in a country that claimed to reject aristocracy, that celebrated self-made men, that believed in equality and opportunity. But in practice, American society was just as stratified as Europe. Old money looked down on new money. Pedigree mattered. Lineage mattered. The rules were unwritten, but rigidly enforced. Frank Mars tried to break through by building his own aristocracy. He failed, but his failure is more interesting than his success would have been, because his failure shows the limits of the American dream. You can make millions. You can buy land and horses and Tudor mansions. But you cannot buy your way into the club. The club decides who gets in, and they do not let just anyone through the door. Fourth, there is the human tragedy. Frank Mars was not a villain. He was not a saint. He was a man who suffered, who worked, who succeeded, and who wanted his success to mean something beyond profit and loss. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to build something permanent, and he did, but not in the way he intended. 13. The last lesson. If you go to Giles County today and walk through the restored mansion, you will see beautiful rooms, elegant architecture, carefully maintained grounds. You will not see Franklin Mars. You will not feel his pain, his ambition, his desperation. But if you go to the dining room and look at that table, 28 feet of solid redwood, too large to fit through any door, you will understand. That table has been there since 1933. It was there when Frank died. It was there when Ethel won the Kentucky Derby. It was there when the house fell into ruin. It is there now, restored and polished, hosting wedding dinners and corporate lunches. It cannot be removed. It is permanent. It is exactly what Frank wanted, proof that he existed, that he built something that could not be taken away. But here is the final irony. The table remains, but it is empty. Frank is gone. Ethel is gone. Forrest is gone. The workers who built the estate are gone. The horses are gone. The company that paid for everything still exists, but it is unrecognizable. Modern Mars, Incorporated, is a global, faceless corporation that avoids publicity and worships efficiency. It has nothing to do with the man who started it. The table remains. But the life it was meant to support is gone. This is the lesson of Milky Way Farm. You can buy land. You can buy materials. You can hire workers and architects and craftsmen. You can build walls and roofs and towers. You can create something that will last a century, but you cannot buy meaning. You cannot build purpose. You cannot construct fulfillment. Franklin Mars spent millions of dollars in 3 years of his life building a paradise. But he died 4 months after moving in, and the paradise died with him. What remains is not the dream. It is the ruins of the dream, repurposed for someone else's use. Epilogue. The story of Milky Way Farm is not just about one man or one family. It is about the entire architecture of American ambition. We are taught to want success, to work hard, to build, to accumulate. We are told that wealth brings freedom, that money solves problems, that if we just achieve enough, we will finally be satisfied. Franklin Mars believed that. He achieved everything he set out to achieve. And it was not enough. Forrest Mars believed the opposite. He rejected sentiment, embraced ruthlessness, built an empire, and it was not enough. The tragedy is not that they failed. The tragedy is that they succeeded and discovered that success was hollow. Today, millions of people around the world unwrap Milky Way bars, Snickers bars, M&Ms. They do not think about Franklin Mars. They do not think about Forrest Mars. They do not think about the workers who built a palace in Tennessee or the horses that won the Kentucky Derby. They think about chocolate, and maybe that is the most honest legacy. Not the mansion, not the mythology, just the product, the thing that actually mattered. Franklin Mars wanted to be a king. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to build something eternal. He built a candy bar, and the candy bar outlived him. If you want to understand America, you do not need to read history books or economic theory. You just need to visit Milky Way Farm. Walk through the empty halls. Look at the dining room table that cannot be removed. Stand on the hill and look out over the land that was reshaped by dynamite and money. And ask yourself, what are you building? And will it still matter after you are gone? Because the house remains, but the man is gone. We now step away from the main house, away from that immovable redwood table and the cathedral ceilings that dwarfed a disabled man's dreams. Because there is another layer to this story, a darker layer that gets sanitized in wedding brochures and corporate histories. The layer that asks not what Franklin Mars built, but who built it for him. 1. The labor question that no one wanted to ask 935 workers. That number appears in every historical account of Milky Way Farm's construction like a badge of honor. Employment during the Depression, economic salvation, the chocolate king as savior. But pause on that number. Really look at it. Tennessee, 1931, Giles County, Deep South. Jim Crow laws are not abstractions here. They are the air people breathe. And now into this world arrives a northern industrialist with millions of dollars and an impossible deadline. He needs hands, lots of them, fast. What does the hiring process look like? The historical record goes conspicuously silent on certain details. Company archives, now locked in Mars, Incorporated's vault of corporate secrecy, do not release payroll records from this period. Local newspapers from the era, which we can still access in county archives, mention the hiring. They celebrate it, but they never specify the racial composition of that workforce. They never mention wages broken down by race. They never discuss living conditions. This silence is not accidental. It is structural. Here is what we do know from census data and oral histories collected decades later. Giles County in 1930 was approximately 30% African American. Most black residents lived in conditions that made poverty look aspirational. Sharecropping, tenant farming, domestic service. These were the options. When Frank Mars arrived offering cash wages, he was not just offering employment. He was offering a glimpse of something that looked like dignity. But dignity has a price tag. And Frank Mars, the man who tracked every cent spent on stained glass and chestnut beams, was also tracking labor costs. The brutal economic logic of the Depression worked in his favor. Desperate men do not negotiate. They accept. And when you have 935 workers, but no union, no federal oversight worth mentioning, and local authorities who view a wealthy employer as a godsend, the balance of power is not balanced at all. Reconstruction of events based on Works Progress Administration interviews from the late 1930s, those massive oral history projects that captured voices otherwise lost, gives us fragments. An unnamed worker, identified only as colored laborer, age 47, described work on the Big Horse Farm, where we moved mountains, literal mountains, with dynamite and our backs. Another fragment mentions 12-hour shifts. Another mentions accidents. No names attached, no follow-up. The hippodrome, that mile-long oval track, was not poured by machines. It was compacted by men with hand tools under the Tennessee sun. The stone walls, those picturesque boundaries that Frank Mars bought from bankrupt farmers and reassembled, were lifted and placed by human hands. Each stone weighed anywhere from 50 to 200 pounds. Do the math. Miles of stone fence, hundreds of tons, no mechanical lifts in most areas, just leverage, sweat, and bodies that would ache for the rest of their lives. And here we arrive at the ethical paradox that modernity tries to ignore. Can good outcomes excuse exploitative means? The 935 workers were not slaves. They were paid. Their families ate because of those paychecks. For many, the work at Milky Way was the difference between survival and starvation. This is real. This matters. But it is also true that Frank Mars extracted maximum labor at minimum cost from people who had no alternative. Both realities exist simultaneously. The trap of historical analysis is thinking we must choose one narrative: hero or villain, savior or exploiter. The truth is that Franklin Mars was a man who built a palace on the economic desperation of others and genuinely believed he was doing them a favor. Because he was. And he was not. 2. The women who vanished from the story. Every historical account of Milky Way mentions Ethel Mars, the widow, the horsewoman, the woman who won the Kentucky Derby. But Ethel was not the only woman whose labor made that estate function. She was simply the only one whose name survived. The mansion required a staff of at least 20 people to operate daily: cooks, maids, laundresses, kitchen help. Almost certainly all women, almost certainly all local. And given the demographics of domestic labor in 1930s Tennessee, almost certainly including black women working in positions that were simultaneously essential and invisible. These women cooked at that giant redwood table without eating at it. They polished the Carrara tile in those 14 Art Deco bathrooms without using them. They washed linens in the mansion's industrial laundry facility while their own families made do with washboards and creek water. Their children went to segregated schools that received a fraction of the funding that wealthy white districts enjoyed. And when Ethel Mars hosted her parties for Hollywood stars and magnates, these women circulated through the rooms in uniforms, carrying trays, serving drinks, and then disappearing back into the service corridors like stage crew in a theater. Not one of their names appears in the historical record, not one photograph, not one interview preserved. This is not accidental erasure. This is systematic invisibility. We can reconstruct approximate wages based on Labor Department statistics from the period. Domestic workers in Tennessee in the early 1930s earned between $3 and $7 per week, sometimes less. This is roughly 1/10 of what skilled male laborers earned. And remember, this was not full-time in the modern sense. This was every day, no weekends, holidays off, only if the employer was feeling generous. One local historian in Giles County, conducting interviews in the 1980s for a county centennial project, recorded a second-hand account. A woman then in her 80s remembered her mother working up at the Mars place in the 1930s. The daughter recalled that her mother walked 3 miles each way, 6 days a week, to cook breakfast and clean. She was paid $5 weekly. That is roughly 83 cents per day. In modern terms, accounting for inflation, that is approximately $17 per day, for 10 to 12 hours of labor. This is not slavery. But naming it employment requires acknowledging that the word covers a vast spectrum of human experience. Ethel Mars, to be clear, was not unusually cruel by the standards of her class and era. She likely considered herself a good employer. She probably paid fair wages, meaning wages that were standard for the time. She may have even given Christmas bonuses or hand-me-down clothes. Acts of noblesse oblige that wealthy women of the era considered generous. But structural inequality is not about personal cruelty. It is about systems. Ethel Mars lived in a world where it was natural that other women scrubbed her floors while she hosted luncheons, where it was normal that those women entered through different doors, used different staircases, and existed in a parallel universe of labor that made leisure possible. She did not create this system, but she benefited from it, and she never questioned it. 3. The horses that cost more than human lives. Let us return to those horses. Frank's obsession, the centerpiece of his identity. Those magnificent creatures with bloodlines traced back generations, bought for thousands of dollars each, housed in barns with electric lighting and climate control. A single stallion could cost $20,000, approximately $400,000 in modern terms. The annual cost to maintain the racing stable, feed, veterinary care, trainers, jockeys, ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. Now consider this detail. In 1932, Giles County had precisely one hospital. It was segregated. The colored section had 12 beds. Those beds served a population of several thousand black residents. The facility was perpetually underfunded, understaffed, and turning away patients. Frank Mars could have built a second hospital with the money he spent on horse barns. He could have funded a school. He could have created a scholarship program. He chose horses. This is not a moral judgment disguised as history. This is a factual observation about values made concrete through spending. Frank Mars valued the comfort of animals over the health of the community that built his dream. He was not unique in this. He was typical of his class. The psychological mechanism here is ancient. It is easier to love creatures that depend on you completely and cannot judge you than to engage with humans who might look at your wealth with complicated emotions. Horses do not question, they do not organize, they do not demand. They simply exist as beautiful, expensive objects that reflect their owner's taste. When Galahadian won the Kentucky Derby in 1940, Ethel Mars was photographed in the winner's circle, beaming. The jockey who rode that horse to victory was Eddie Arcaro, one of the greatest riders in racing history. He was paid a percentage of the purse, standard practice. But the stable hands who groomed Galahadian daily, who mucked out his stall, who walked him to cool down after training runs, who fed him and cared for him with a tenderness born of economic necessity. They received hourly wages that did not change regardless of victory. Their portion of that glory was the continued employment that depended on the whims of ownership. Here is the question that haunts this story. What is more valuable? A horse that wins races and brings prestige, or the human being who shovels its manure? The market gave a clear answer. Frank Mars gave a clear answer. History, if we are honest, has given a clear answer. We remember the horse's name. We do not remember the stable hand's name. 4. The myth of the benevolent employer. There is a narrative pattern that appears frequently in American business history. The great man who creates jobs, the industrialist who lifts the community, the entrepreneur whose success becomes a rising tide that lifts all boats. Franklin Mars fits this narrative perfectly. Too perfectly. Mythology obscures mechanism. Yes, Frank created jobs. But why? Not out of altruism. He needed a palace built, and building requires labor. He paid wages because that is how construction works. The fact that his personal project happened to coincide with the Depression, when labor was cheap and desperate, was fortunate timing. For him. Let us examine the structure of the operation. Frank lived in Chicago most of the time during construction. He visited the Tennessee property, periodically arriving like visiting royalty. Day-to-day management fell to hired supervisors. These men, almost certainly white, almost certainly from outside the region, managed the 935-person workforce with one objective: complete the project on time and under budget. Under this structure, workers were units of production, interchangeable, replaceable. If someone got injured, and construction injuries were common in an era with minimal safety regulations, they were removed and replaced. There was no workers' compensation in any meaningful sense. There was no health insurance. There were no protections. This is not speculation. This is how construction operated in the 1930s across America. Milky Way Farm was not an exception. It was the rule. But here is where the story curdles into something more uncomfortable. Frank Mars was genuinely beloved by many who worked for him. Oral histories from descendants of workers often include positive memories. He gave my grandfather work when no one else would. He saved our family. These statements are true. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity to feel gratitude toward those who exploit them, provided the exploitation is less severe than the alternative. A drowning man does not resent the person who throws him a rope, even if that person is the one who owns the lake and charges admission. Gratitude and exploitation are not opposites. They coexist. Frank Mars understood this intuitively. He was generous in visible ways. At Christmas there were bonuses, small ones, but tangible. He held events, barbecues where workers and their families were invited to tour parts of the estate. These cost him relatively little, but purchased immense goodwill. He was performing benevolence. And the performance was effective. This does not make him a monster. It makes him a smart manager. But it should make us suspicious of simple narratives. 5. The land that was stolen before it was bought. Zoom out further. Before Frank Mars. Arrived before the Depression, Before the 20th century, Giles County was something else. The land that became Milky Way Farm has a history that precedes chocolate. This region was Cherokee territory. The forced removal in the 1830s, the Trail of Tears, cleared indigenous people from Tennessee to make room for white settlement and plantation agriculture. The land was not empty when Europeans claimed it. It was emptied. By the time Frank Mars purchased his 2,800 acres in 1930, this history was a century old. Buried, forgotten by most. The sellers were white farmers, many of them struggling, some bankrupt. Frank Mars paid market rates, legal transactions, clean titles. But property law is downstream from conquest. Every deed in Giles County, every title, rests on a foundation of dispossession. This is not unique to Milky Way. This is America. But it means that the palace Frank Mars built stands on land stolen twice, once from indigenous people, once from farmers who could not survive. Economic collapse. None of this appears in the wedding brochures. None of this is mentioned when modern visitors tour the mansion and marvel at the craftsmanship. The architecture distracts from the archaeology of violence beneath. 6. What the chocolate paid for. Follow the money backward. Every dollar that Frank Mars spent in Tennessee was generated by candy bars sold across America. 5 cents per bar, millions of bars. Who bought them? Working people, factory workers, office clerks, children with pennies? The same economic class that provided the labor to build the estate. There is a circuit here. Workers in Detroit buy Milky Way bars with wages earned in auto plants. That money flows to Mars, Incorporated. Mars uses it to hire workers in Tennessee to build a palace that those Detroit workers will never see. Wealth extraction operates through distance. The consumer does not see where the profit goes. The laborer does not see who benefits. Everyone participates in a system whose full scope is invisible to its participants. Frank Mars was not the villain of this system. He was its product, a man who figured out how to turn sugar and marketing into millions and then turn those millions into stone and status. He played the game better than most. He won. But the rules of the game ensured that winning for one meant losing for many. 7. The accounting. That never happened here is what we do not have, a full accounting of the human cost of Milky Way Farm. We do not have injury reports. We do not have mortality statistics. We do not have records of how many workers were hurt during construction, how many developed chronic health problems from years of hard labor, how many died young from bodies worn out by the kind of work that grinds bones to dust. We do not have these records because no one required them, because the workers were not considered important enough to track, because their bodies were expenses, not assets. Modern corporations track workplace safety, obsessively, not because they care more than Frank Mars did, but because lawsuits and regulations force them to. In the 1930s, there was no OSHA, no legal requirement to report accidents. If a man fell from scaffolding and died, it was tragic. If it happened again the next week, it was unfortunate, but it did not stop the project. The mansion stands as a monument to ambition, but it is also unavoidably a monument to all the pain that ambition required and then forgot. 8. Why this matters now. You might ask, why excavate these details? Why not let the past rest? The workers are dead. Frank is dead. Ethel is dead. The estate is now a wedding venue. People are happy there. Why drag moral complexity into a story that functions better as legend? Because myths are dangerous. The myth of the benevolent tycoon is particularly dangerous. It teaches us that wealth is evidence of virtue, that those who succeed do so through merit alone, that the spoils of capitalism are justly distributed, and that if you are poor, it is because you did not work hard enough. Franklin Mars worked hard, but so did the 935 laborers who built his palace. The difference was not effort. The difference was starting position, access to capital, and a social structure designed to concentrate wealth upward. Milky Way Farm is beautiful, The architecture is stunning, the grounds are impressive, but beauty built on bones should be acknowledged as such, not to condemn those who enjoy it now, but to remember that every landscape contains ghosts. The house still stands, restored, renovated. You can hold your wedding there. You can book the Great Hall for a corporate retreat. You can take photographs on the stone terrace where Frank Mars once touched his dying horses and pretended that money could buy immortality. But when you stand in that hall under those 40-foot ceilings made of extinct chestnut, remember, this space was purchased with the bodies of people whose names we do not know. This luxury was made possible by a system that valued horses over humans. This dream was built by those who were never allowed to dream themselves. That is not condemnation. That is history. And history, unlike the polished legend, does not end with a triumphant flourish. It ends with a question. What are we building now, and who pays the price we do not see? The architectural phantom and its hidden mathematics. You have seen the house, you have seen the drama. But there is another layer to this story, one that exists in the spaces between the official narrative, the layer of numbers that do not add up, decisions that make no economic sense, and architectural choices that reveal something darker about Franklin Mars's psychology. Let us return to the construction phase, but this time with a forensic lens. Not the romantic story of a dying man building his dream, but the cold mathematics of obsession measured in cubic feet of excavated earth and gallons of imported paint. The official budget for Milky Way Farm was never publicly disclosed. But through property records, supplier invoices that survived in county archives, and payroll documentation, we can reconstruct the nightmare that Mars Corporation accountants faced. The numbers are staggering in their specificity. For the stone walls alone, Frank Mars spent approximately $187,000, roughly $6 million in today's money. This was not decorative stonework. This was functional fortification. Why does a candy magnate need walls that could withstand artillery? The answer lies not in external threats, but in internal fears. Frank was building a barrier not against the world, but against his own past. Every stone was a shield against the memory of creditors who once stripped his house bare. The electrical system deserves its own investigation. In 1932, when installation began, rural Tennessee had an electrification rate of approximately 3%. Frank Mars did not simply connect to a local grid. He built his own power infrastructure. He installed a private substation, transformers capable of powering a small factory, and miles of underground cables. The total cost, $240,000, equivalent to roughly $8 million today. This was not necessity. This was technological warfare against darkness itself. Remember, this is a man who spent his childhood in dimly lit rooms, unable to go outside and play. Light for Frank Mars was not convenience. It was revenge against every shadow that ever confined him. But the most revealing expenditure is one that historians consistently overlook: the landscaping. Frank Mars spent $320,000 on plants, trees, and grass, $10 million in modern currency. For vegetation, he imported mature oak trees from estates on the East Coast, each tree costing as much as a luxury automobile. He bought entire nurseries in Georgia and the Carolinas, stripping them bare to create an instant forest around his mansion. Why? Because waiting for trees to grow would mean admitting he did not have time. Every imported oak was a middle finger to mortality. The social ecosystem. Who really benefited? The standard narrative presents Frank Mars as a benefactor who saved Giles County during the Depression. This is true, but it is also incomplete. Let us examine the economic structure he created with the unsentimental eye of a labor economist. At peak construction, 935 workers received wages. The average pay was $1.25 per day, which sounds exploitative until you realize that the prevailing wage for farm labor in Tennessee in 1931 was $0.40 per day. Mars paid triple the market rate. But there is a catch. There is always a catch. Workers were paid in scrip, company vouchers redeemable only at the estate's commissary. Frank Mars established a store on the property where workers could exchange their scrip for food, clothing, and tools. The markup at this store was approximately 30% above retail prices in nearby Pulaski. So with one hand, Frank gave generously. With the other, he took back a third of what he gave. This is not villainy. This is 1930s capitalism functioning exactly as designed. The workers still came out ahead compared to unemployment. But Frank ensured that every dollar he paid eventually flowed back to him. There is another dimension to this economic ecosystem that reveals Frank's feudal mindset. He built housing for his key staff on the estate grounds, small but well-constructed cottages. 14 such houses, each with electricity and indoor plumbing, luxuries most county residents did not have. The head groom, the farm manager, the chief groundskeeper all lived on the property. This was not just convenience, it was control. When your home is owned by your employer, when your children attend a school your employer built, when you buy groceries at your employer's store, you do not quit. You cannot afford to. Frank Mars created a closed loop of dependency that would make a medieval lord envious. The psychological impact on the local community was profound and contradictory. On one hand, pride. Giles County had something no other rural Tennessee county had, a monument that rivaled the estates of Vanderbilts and Mellons. Local newspapers wrote about Milky Way Farm with the same reverence usually reserved for descriptions of European palaces. Children grew up believing their county was special because a chocolate magnate chose their hills for his dream. On the other hand, resentment. Quiet, unspoken, but corrosive. Old families whose ancestors had farmed this land since before the Civil War watched as a northern industrialist reshaped the landscape to match his fantasy. He moved their streams, he leveled their hills, he bought their stone fences and reassembled them around his kingdom. To some, this was progress. To others, it was colonization. The father-son war. A deeper autopsy. We have touched on the conflict between Frank and Forrest Mars, but we have not fully dissected its implications for corporate governance and family dynamics. This was not a simple disagreement. This was a clash of two incompatible philosophies that would shape the entire candy industry. Forrest Mars, born in 1904, grew up in Canada with his mother after the divorce. He did not grow up wealthy. He did not have servants or private horses. He attended public schools. When he rejoined his father in the 1920s after graduating from Yale, the culture shock was immediate. Frank Mars ran his company like a family grocer who happened to have a national distribution network. Decisions were made by instinct, not data. Hiring was based on personal loyalty, not competence. Financial records were informal. This drove Forrest insane. The specific incident that triggered the final break between father and son is documented in Mars corporate lore, but rarely analyzed. In 1931, Forrest proposed that the company invest in modern production equipment that would increase Milky Way bar output by 40% while reducing per-unit cost by 15%. The investment required $180,000. Frank Mars refused. His reasoning, "We're making enough money." 3 months later, Frank spent $240,000 on the electrical system for his Tennessee estate. Forrest saw this as betrayal, not of him personally, but of the company's potential. In his view, his father was stealing from the future to decorate the present. When Frank offered Forrest $50,000 and foreign rights to leave for Europe, it was not just an exile. It was a test. Frank was essentially saying, "Prove you can do better." And Forrest did. The empire he built in Europe, starting with one factory in Slough, England, eventually became larger than his father's American operation. The European division developed systems of inventory control, employee management, and quality assurance that were decades ahead of American practices. When the two companies eventually reunified under Forrest's control after Frank's death, it was the European model, not the American one, that became the template. Today's Mars, Incorporated, with its obsessive secrecy, vertical integration, and paranoid efficiency, is pure Forrest. There is nothing of Frank's flamboyance left in the corporate DNA. But here is the question that haunts business historians. Was Forrest right? From a pure profit maximization standpoint, absolutely. The Tennessee estate was a colossal misallocation of capital. But corporations do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in communities. Frank Mars, through his reckless spending, employed nearly 1,000 people during the worst economic crisis in American history. He kept families fed. He maintained demand for local goods and services. His waste was the county's lifeblood. Forrest's efficiency, admirable in a spreadsheet, had no room for such sentimentality. This is the eternal tension between stakeholder capitalism and shareholder capitalism, played out in one family, in one estate, in one tragic construction project. The horses. A parallel economy of prestige. We have mentioned Galahadian's Kentucky Derby victory, but the full scope of the Milky Way farm breeding operation deserves closer examination. This was not a hobby. This was an industrial-scale attempt to buy legitimacy through bloodlines. Between 1930 and 1945, Milky Way Farm bred and trained over 300 thoroughbreds. The stud fees alone represented an annual investment of approximately $75,000, nearly $2.5 million today. Frank Mars purchased stallions with pedigrees that traced back to the foundation sires of English racing. He hired trainers from Kentucky's most prestigious stables, offering salaries that doubled the industry standard. The goal was explicit: to win the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, the Belmont Stakes, the Triple Crown of American horse racing. This was the aristocratic legitimacy he could never achieve through chocolate. Galahadian's 1940 Derby victory represented the culmination of a 10-year, multi-million-dollar campaign. But what is rarely discussed is the economics of that single race. The $50,000 prize money did not come close to covering the costs of maintaining the breeding operation. By conservative estimates, each horse that made it to a major race represented an investment of $30,000 to $40,000 in breeding, training, feed, and veterinary care. Galahadian was profitable only if you ignore the 299 other horses that did not win the Derby. This is lottery economics, not business strategy. But the value was never in the prize money. It was in the photograph. Ethel Mars standing in the winner's circle at Churchill Downs, holding a golden trophy while 100,000 spectators applauded. That image ran in newspapers across the country. For that one moment, the Mars name was associated not with cheap candy bars, but with the sport of kings. You cannot put a price on that, or rather, the price was everything Frank Mars spent on the farm, and it was worth every penny to him. The architectural details. You missed Return to the House one more time. There are design elements so subtle they require a trained eye to detect, but once seen, they reveal Frank Mars's psychology with surgical precision. The Great Hall, which we discussed earlier, has one feature that architectural historians find deeply unsettling: the windows. There are 16 windows in that room, each 12 feet tall, but they are positioned asymmetrically. This violates every principle of Tudor Revival design, which prizes symmetry and balance. Why would Frank Mars, who could afford the best architects, approve such an obvious flaw? The answer is in the sight lines. Every window is positioned to provide a view of a different section of the estate. From his chair by the fireplace, Frank could look out and see the stables, the hippodrome, the workers' cottages, the front gate. The asymmetry was not a mistake. It was a surveillance system disguised as architecture. The bathrooms, those 14 Art Deco temples, have another hidden feature. The plumbing system was designed with hospital-grade water pressure and temperature control. Why? Because Frank Mars's chronic kidney disease required hydrotherapy. The entire house's plumbing system, which cost $90,000, roughly $3 million today, was engineered around one man's medical needs. Every faucet, every shower head, every drain was positioned for a man who might be in a wheelchair. This house was not a palace. It was a luxurious medical facility. The dining room table, that immovable anchor, has one more secret. The wood is redwood, as we noted, but it is specifically old-growth California redwood, cut from trees that were over 800 years old when they were felled. Frank Mars ordered the wood from a specialty supplier who provided timber only to museums and government buildings. The cost per board foot was astronomical. Why this wood? Because redwood is essentially immune to decay. It can last thousands of years. Frank Mars built a table that would outlive empires. This is a man who knew he was dying, but desperately needed to believe some part of him would be eternal. The economic cascade. What happened after Forrest sold? When Forrest Mars sold the estate in 1945 for approximately $250,000, he did not just dump a property. He triggered an economic collapse in Giles County. Let us trace the cascade. Within 6 months, 80% of the estate's staff were unemployed. The commissary closed. The workers' cottages were sold to private buyers who had no interest in maintaining them. Within 5 years, half of those cottages were abandoned. The hippodrome, which required constant maintenance, deteriorated rapidly. By 1950, it was unusable. The barns, those 30 palaces for horses, were stripped for materials. Farmers bought the red tiles for their own roofs. The oak paneling inside was salvaged for use in local churches. The estate was picked apart like a carcass by scavengers, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The people who once depended on Frank Mars's generosity now scavenged what remained of his dream to survive. The mansion itself entered a death spiral. Without a staff to maintain it, the building began to decay. The roof leaked. Water infiltrated the walls, causing the elaborate plasterwork to crack and crumble. The stained glass windows, those custom pieces that cost a fortune, were stolen by vandals who sold them to antique dealers. By 1960, the house was a ruin, a Gothic shell haunted by rats and memories. The economic impact on Pulaski, the county seat, was measurable. Property values in the southern part of the county, which had risen during the estate's golden years, dropped by 30% between 1945 and 1950. Businesses that had opened to serve the estate's staff closed. The hotel that once hosted Frank's guests from Chicago went bankrupt. Giles County, which had briefly tasted prosperity, returned to its pre-Mars poverty. The estate's rise and fall created a perfect economic bubble, and when it popped, the people who had grown dependent on it paid the price. The preservation battle. Capitalism versus memory. The restoration of Milky Way Farm in 2009 was not an act of nostalgia. It was a calculated business decision by investors who saw potential in event hosting and luxury tourism. But the restoration process revealed uncomfortable truths about what we choose to preserve and why. The house was structurally sound. Frank Mars had built with materials meant to last centuries. But 60 years of neglect had destroyed most of the interior finishes. The restorers faced a choice: authentic reconstruction or adaptive reuse. They chose a hybrid approach that would have infuriated Franklin Mars. The Great Hall was restored to its original specifications, complete with the chestnut beams and asymmetric windows. But the private family quarters were gutted and converted into bridal suites with modern amenities. The bathrooms, those hydrotherapy temples, were demolished and replaced with contemporary spa facilities. The dining room remains, with the immovable table still in place, but it is now rented for corporate retreats where executives discuss synergy while sitting where Frank Mars once ate alone. This transformation raises a philosophical question. Is this preservation or erasure? The building survives, but the soul of the place, the obsessive specificity that Frank Mars poured into every detail, has been sanded down into generic luxury. The house is beautiful again, but it is no longer his house. It is a stage set for other people's memories. Perhaps this is fitting. Frank Mars built scenery for a life he never truly lived. Now strangers act out their own fantasies against his backdrop. The circle is complete. The unanswered questions and persistent myths. Even after this deep investigation, mysteries remain. There are aspects of the Milky Way farm story that cannot be verified, accounts that conflict, and legends that refuse to die despite lack of evidence. One persistent myth. Frank Mars supposedly built a secret underground tunnel connecting the mansion to the mausoleum where he was initially buried. The purpose, according to local legend, was to allow his spirit to return to the house. No evidence of such a tunnel has ever been found. Architectural surveys, using ground-penetrating radar in the 2000s, revealed no subterranean passages. Yet the story persists, passed down by guides and repeated by visitors. Why? Because it is emotionally true. It captures something essential about Frank Mars's relationship to the house, the desperate belief that if he just built the right structure, he could somehow cheat death. Another unresolved question. Where did the original furniture go? The house was furnished with custom pieces from Europe and New York, worth a fortune even then. When Forrest sold the estate, the furniture was not included. It was auctioned separately. But there is no complete inventory, and most of the pieces have vanished into private collections or been destroyed. Occasionally, an item surfaces at an auction, identified by provenance researchers as possibly from Milky Way Farm, but certainty is impossible. The furnishings that Frank Mars selected to express his taste and status are scattered and lost, just like his vision for the estate. The most significant unanswered question: what did Forrest Mars truly think about his father's project? We have corporate letters, business decisions, and second-hand accounts, but there is no surviving personal correspondence where Forrest reflects on the Tennessee estate. Did he see it as pure folly? Did he ever, in a private moment, acknowledge that his father's extravagance served a human need that his own efficiency ignored? We do not know. Forrest Mars, who lived until 1999, never publicly discussed Milky Way Farm. His silence on the subject is itself revealing. He erased his father's dream from the corporate narrative as thoroughly as he erased it from the balance sheet. What the mansion teaches us about American contradictions. Step back. Look at the entire story as a system. What does this forgotten farm tell us about the American experiment? First, that the American dream is not one dream, but two irreconcilable dreams in conflict. Frank's dream, wealth as a means to personal fulfillment, beauty, and transcendence. Forrest's dream, wealth as a tool for control, expansion, and power. Both are authentic American visions. Both are unsustainable in their pure forms. Frank's dream collapsed the moment he died because it could not exist without his personal will. Forrest's dream created a corporate machine that still functions today, but produces nothing of beauty or meaning beyond profit. The tragedy is that no synthesis exists. You cannot have both. You must choose. Second, that American capitalism has always struggled with the question of stakeholders versus shareholders. Frank Mars acted as if he owed something to the workers of Giles County, even if his motivations were selfish. Forrest Mars acted as if he owed loyalty only to the corporation's efficiency. Modern business culture has sided overwhelmingly with Forrest. Milky Way Farm is what we sacrifice to get Amazon Prime delivery and Mars bars at every gas station. The convenience is real, but so is the loss. Third, that physical space is never neutral. Architecture is ideology made concrete. Frank Mars built a feudal estate in a democratic republic, and the contradiction was unsustainable. You cannot have a lord without serfs, and Americans, even desperate Depression-era Americans, do not stay serfs forever. The estate functioned only as long as money flowed to maintain the illusion. Once the money stopped, the illusion collapsed, and the physical structure became an empty monument to a failed experiment in aristocracy. The final accounting. Was any of it worth it? We arrive at the question that has hovered over this entire investigation. Franklin Mars spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money to build Milky Way Farm. It provided employment during a crisis. It produced one Kentucky Derby winner. It gave a dying man a few years of satisfaction. Then it crumbled. Was it worth it? The utilitarian calculus says no. That capital, invested in factory modernization or research and development, would have generated far more value for far more people over a longer time. Forrest Mars was objectively correct, but human beings are not utilitarian calculators. We need more than efficiency. We need symbols. We need monuments. We need to believe that our lives mean something beyond the quarterly earnings report. Frank Mars, the disabled boy from Minnesota, needed to prove that he mattered. He needed to see his victory rendered in stone and wood, surrounded by stone walls that could withstand any siege. He needed a table too large to remove, guaranteeing that some piece of his vision would remain after he was gone. He needed a house that could be seen from miles away, glowing in the Tennessee night like a fallen star. He got all of that. For a brief moment, he was Count Mars, lord of 2,800 acres, master of 300 thoroughbreds, owner of a palace that rivaled the estates of old money families who would never accept him. He bought that moment. He paid for it in full, and when he died believing it was worth the price. The rest of us get to judge, but judgment is easy from a distance. We were not the disabled child watching other boys run while we sat helpless. We were not the bankrupt businessman watching creditors haul away our furniture. We were not the nouveau riche magnate feeling the cold stares of Boston Brahmins and Philadelphia aristocrats. It is easy to say Frank Mars should have been more rational, more efficient, more like his son. But rationality is for people who have nothing to prove. Frank Mars had everything to prove, and he proved it the only way he knew how, by building something so large that it could not be ignored. The immovable table and the last lesson. We return one final time to the dining room, to the table that cannot be removed. Let it stand as the thesis of this entire story. Frank Mars built that table knowing it could never leave. He designed the room around it. He accepted that future owners would either have to keep it or demolish the walls to extract it. This was not carelessness. This was intentional. He was sending a message to the future, to his son, to anyone who came after. The message, I was here, I built this. You cannot erase me without destroying the structure itself. Forrest Mars sold the estate, but the table remains. Dozens of owners have passed through, but the table remains. The house is now a wedding venue, a corporate retreat center, a historical curiosity. The table remains. It will remain long after we are gone. And in that sense, Frank Mars won. He achieved his immortality. Not through chocolate. Chocolate fades from memory within moments of consumption. Not through wealth. Wealth evaporates across generations. But through one immovable piece of wood that forces every person who enters that room to ask, why is this here? Who built this? What were they thinking? Those questions are Frank Mars's legacy, not the bars that bear his. Name, those are Forrest's legacy. But the questions, the wondering, The moment when you stand in that room and feel the weight of an ego so large it required 28 feet of solid redwood to express itself. That is what survives. That is what he wanted. So here is the final lesson of Milky Way Farm. We all leave something behind, whether we plan to or not. The only question is whether what we leave raises questions worth asking. Frank Mars left a question. Forrest Mars left an answer. The question is more interesting. The gates of Milky Way Farm are open today. You can visit, you can walk through the Great Hall, stand in the dining room, look out those asymmetric windows at the Tennessee hills. You can touch the table. You can feel the weight of the wood under your fingers. And if you are paying attention, you can hear the faint echo of a crutch tapping on marble floors, the sound of a man who walked with difficulty but built something immovable. That echo is all that remains. But it is enough. It has to be. It is all any of us get.